everybody, Andrew Cuneo here. Today I wanted to go over the Explorer deck that I've probably spent the most time on, which is this blue-white Teferi Lotus Field deck, which I've named Explorer Esper. It's Esper without the black, I like to think of it as. So it's pretty similar to strategies that have gotten played in Historic a lot, you know, just blue-white Teferi Lotus Field decks. The difference is you don't have access to Archmage's Charm in Explorer, so that's going to drive some different deck building choices. Also, the decks you're going to play against are going to be different. There's substantially different archetypes played in Explorer compared to Historic. If you're used to Historic, you'd be expecting to play like against a lot of Phoenix, a lot of Food, some blue-white auras. Phoenix and Food both exist in weaker forms. The auras decks really don't exist at all. So that's going to lead to some slightly different deck building choices. So I'm going to go over what the kind of the decision points are in building this deck, and also, you know, why I've chosen to make the choices that I did. So for starters, you have to decide whether you want to play with Lotus Field or not play with Lotus Field. If you don't play with Lotus Field, it's a little bit more accessible to play a third color. Lotus Field puts a lot of pressure on you about what lands you're going to play in your deck. And since it only taps for mana of any one color at a time, if you're looking at trying to be able to play some sort of gold card that includes your third color of mana, like say you wanted to play Void Rend, Lotus Field is really not that good at allowing you to cast Void Rend. It's going to make it so that it's pretty awkward to cast later on in the game. So that's one of the appeals of not playing with Lotus Field. I think the main appeal of playing with Lotus Field is that you just get some really explosive draws. In some ways, this sort of style of really like creatureless control is a little bit underpowered relative to the mid-range decks that exist in Explorer. You can certainly see that in Standard, where nobody really plays creatureless control decks anymore because the mid-range threats are so good. That has bled over somewhat into older formats as well, where if you want to play, you know, just only Planeswalkers and, you know, no creatures, not really try to play to the board, your cards are going to get overpowered. One way to make up for that is to just have Lotus Field in your deck, which means that you can do things like play Teferi on turn 4 with this deck and use the Teferi to untap your Lotus Field and then play the Wandering Emperor or Memory Deluge. So you're upping the power level of your deck. You're increasing the quality of your good draws a fair amount by incorporating Lotus Field. Obviously, that necessitates playing with cards that enable you to cheat the Lotus Field into play, which the best one is Strict Proctor. This is something that people have tried a lot in Historic, and it's pretty good in Historic. I think it's also good here. So you're going to play 4 of those. There are also some decks in Explorer that Strict Proctor is just very effective against. It's pretty annoying for your opponents if it's in play. So that's a nice added benefit. And then you're also going to want to play a few more cards to allow you to cheat the Lotus Field into play. The options that are legal in Explorer are Tail's End and Discontinuity. I've got a 2-1 split right now. I've mostly played with 3 copies of Discontinuity, and I do think Discontinuity is a more generally useful card. It's pretty easy to turn it into kind of a time warp if you cast it during your opponent's upkeep. Also, if you're going to be playing against other Shark Typhoon decks, it's very nice to just have access to a bunch of Discontinuities to stop your opponent from end of turn Shark Typhooning you. Same thing with the Wandering Emperor, if somebody's going to flash that into play. So it's certainly good in mirrors. I wanted to try one Tail's End because playing with this deck, I have felt that it's a little bit lacking in terms of actual turn 2 plays, which Discontinuity really is not a turn 2 play. So Tail's End, it gives you a turn 2 way to counter a Greasefang. Greasefang's one of the more important archetypes in this format, and so that's nice. Also, I just wanted a little bit more diversity, so I'm going to try out Tail's End today. We'll see how it compares to Discontinuity. That's one big decision point in how to construct the deck. Another big decision point is, should you play 80 cards and play Yorion? And I think the answer to that is no. Certainly, if you want to play with Lotus Field, I would say definitely do not play with Yorion. You do not want to water down your Strict Proctor Lotus Field draws or your Discontinuity Lotus Field draws. And adding 20 more cards to your deck is just going to dilute that synergy. There's no way to get additional redundancy. Like, you can only play 4 Lotus Fields. There's not another card like Lotus Field you can add to your deck when you're looking to add 20 additional cards. If you wanted to play blue-white, no Lotus Field, it's maybe a little bit more appealing to play Yorion. I still don't think it's a great idea. I think that you're watering down, the good mana fixing in your deck too much. Like, you're just going to draw Hallowed Fountain less often, and Hallowed Fountain's your best land. You're also just going to draw fewer Teferi 5s, which that's kind of what your deck is built around. And the other catch that I think is really big when you shift from, if you remember playing Standard with Yorion to playing Explorer, is Omen of the Sea went from a card that was like quite reasonable to play in Standard when it was legal to, I think it is a pretty overcosted card if you're moving back into older formats. So I would not be excited about having Omen of the Sea in my deck, which means I'm not going to be excited to play Yorion. So that's why I'm not doing that. Now we get into some of the cards that are the cheap removal spells. I kind of have a mix of the reasonable options. March of Otherworldly Light, Fateful Absence, Portable Hole. And whenever you're building a control deck, it's rarely the case that you're going to say, okay, this is the best removal spell. I want to have 4 of it, and then I'm not going to play other things. You want a little bit of flexibility, and as you play through the game, your goal is going to be to try to get get the removal to line up against the threats, and by giving yourself options, you're going to have, an ability to maneuver like that. So March of Otherworldly Light is nice in that it exiles, that's a big deal. It can hit the creature lands. Also, you have the ability to pitch cards to it if you need to, if you have lots of cards in your hand, but not enough time to cast them all, you can get the efficiency boost here. Fateful Absence is, I think, necessary because March of Otherworldly Light cannot hit Planeswalkers, and you need some ability to get Planeswalkers off the board. If you're coming from Historic to Explorer, you are going to find that Planeswalkers are going to get cast a little bit more often. Like, 4-mana Chandra is a pretty appropriately powered card for Explorer, where in Historic it's a little bit underwhelming. So you do need to have some access to Fateful Absence, I would say. Portable Hole is nice just because it's so efficient. It does not work well with having Strict Proctor in play. That is one kind of gotcha moment you have to look out for when you're playing with this deck. If you have a Strict Proctor in play, it effectively makes your Portable Hole cost 3. That said, Portable Hole is so efficient that I think it's still worth playing. It's a really great answer to a card like Ledger Shredder, which you're going to see some. I've got 4 Jwari Disruptions in my deck. This is something that is another thing that I think is part of the Lotus Field package. If you're going to play with Lotus Field, you want to just play with a lot of lands because, Lotus Field is going to be one of your lands, but it's not going to be a land that you can play on turn 2. It's not going to be a land that you always want to be able to play on turn 3. So you want to just have a lot of lands. This deck has 28 lands in it if you're including Jwari Disruptions. And so Jwari Disruptions, it gives you something to do on turn 2, but it also gives you a way to make sure you're making your land drops because you're going to sometimes put a Lotus Field into play and have to sack the 2 lands. That's fine. I mean, you're still getting a card that's going to be very powerful when you resolve a Teferi. Getting to untap your Lotus Field with Teferi is great. So I think you want minimum 3 copies of Jwari Disruption. I've gone with the full 4. I think that's really nice. I've got a tiny amount of counters in my deck. Dovin's Veto and 2 Saw It Comings. I think you want to play a little bit of this. It's not really super well situated for Explorer, so I would not play a ton of it. It's a card that I like, especially Saw It Coming is, I think, a card you're going to be looking to board out sometimes. Anytime you're playing against a deck that's just a more aggressive deck that's just looking to play 2 and 3 mana permanents, onto the board. I think that you're going to be looking for your sideboard cards to be better answers to those than kind of a generic catch-all like Saw It Coming. Some people do play Absorb over at Saw It Coming. I think Absorb is just a terrible, terrible Magic card. I would never want to play with it. So the problem with Absorb is, what's the value of gaining the 3 life? And I think unless you're playing against someone who's looking to cast, Skewer the Critics to just deal 3 damage to you, or they're going to play with fire and they're going to just target your face, the 3 life you're gaining really is not that big of an advantage. So it's certainly not... Yeah, I mean, it's certainly there are lots of matchups where gaining 3 life is completely meaningless. Like if you're playing a Control Mirror, if you're playing against some sort of mid-range deck that is going to beat you by just getting ahead on board and defending the presence on the board, the 3 life really does nothing in a lot of matchups. And you're playing with a counter that's harder to cast than a lot of other options, because remember, it's blue, blue, white to cast. It's not just... that's not a free difference, especially because Dovin's Veto is also a card that costs blue and white to cast. If you think about it, if you get in a spot where you want to be able to cast your 3-mana counter and a Dovin's Veto at the same time, the additional white mana in Absorb matters a lot, because you now need 3 blue and 2 white, as opposed to 3 blue, a white, and a colorless. So you're giving up an ability to, easily be able to cast your 2 counters at the same time. And there's just counters that are available that have other utility. So I've gone with Saw It Coming because of the Foretell ability. I think the Foretell ability is really, really strong, especially with Teferi. If you're talking about a turn where you're going to be casting Teferi and you haven't gotten a Lotus Field into play yet, if you have a Foretold Saw It Coming, the 2 lands you untap with the Teferi are going to be enough to cast your Saw It Coming. Also, this is a format where Thoughtseize is legal, so being able to protect your counter by foretelling it from a Thoughtseize matters. I think just overall, you can do much better than Absorb. There's also Neutralize, which cycles. I don't think that's as good as Saw It Coming, but I think it's still better than Absorb. There's Disallow, which is kind of a stifle / 3-mana counter. I think that's better than Absorb, but not as good as Saw It Coming. There's also Sinister Sabotage, which allows you to surveil. Again, I think that's better than Absorb, but still worse than Saw It Coming. There are lots of options that are not Absorb, and I just would never play with Absorb. All right, so what else we got to talk about? The mix of card drawing. I've got 1 Narset, 2 Memory Deluges. I think that's a reasonable split. I do think that, especially in a Lotus Field build, you're going to want to play with Memory Deluge to some extent, just because getting to the 7 mana to flash it back is going to happen a lot once you've cheated a Lotus Field into play. I like having 1 Narset just because it gives you a little bit more game against a Resolve Teferi. It's also nice in that it interacts, it can shut down the second turn, or the second step of Fable of the Mirror Breaker. It can help you a little bit against Ledger Shredder. So there are some spots where Narset is nice. The one thing that's not great about Narset, though, is that this is a format where people play to the board a lot. So you're not going to play a lot of matchups where it just sits there in play. Like, you're going to have to defend it if you want to keep it in play, and that's not always going to be easy to do, which is why I went with a few more Memory Deluges. Then we get to the sweepers. The sweepers are really interesting. So I'm going to classify the Wandering Emperor kind of like a sweeper, because I think it fills the role of a sweeper a lot of the time in a deck like this. Even though you're only going to get to exile 1 creature with it, you exile 1 creature and you're left with something behind, which helps you clean up the rest of the board. I also just think the Wandering Emperor is a great card, and it's the same mana cost as a lot of the sweepers, so it's competing with them in the deck. And I've gone heavily on the Wandering Emperor rather than playing some of the sweepers. Now, I do have 1 Farewell, which I like 1 Farewell as a card to dig to if you're playing against somebody who's, they're playing Cat Oven, they've put a lot of artifacts and enchantments into play, or you really need to get rid of someone's graveyard in game 1. And then I've got 1 Doomskar, again, just for a little bit more flexibility. Now, there are a couple other choices you could play. There's Depopulate. There's Shatter the Sky, which Shadow of the Sky and Depopulate are kind of competing head-to-head. And it's just a question of which matchup is the drawback going to come up, or when is the drawback going to come up less? And for a while I played with Shadow of the Sky, but I became convinced that Depopulate was the one where the matchup actually comes up, or the drawback comes up less. And that's mostly because I think Mono Green, which I made a video about earlier, is one, it's become a somewhat popular deck. And certainly Shadow of the Sky against Mono Green is a little bit lackluster, whereas Depopulate is just going to be Day of Judgment. There's also Settle the Wreckage, which that is a card that I know a lot of people love because they kind of feel like it leads to these incredible blowout games. I think that really doesn't come up that much, and I also think this is just kind of a mediocre card. I think with the printing of the Wandering Emperor, Settle the Wreckage is just obsolete. The Wandering Emperor is just a much better card than it, and it does the same thing but in a less spectacular fashion, but it's way more reliable for you. You can just, even if your opponent doesn't have anything going on, if you just need to be able to pressure a Planeswalker, you can cast it. If you're playing a Control Mirror, rather than having a card that doesn't do anything, you have a card that is good. So I would never play with the Settle the Wreckage now that the Wandering Emperor exists. And then for Teferis, that's what the deck is built around. Sometimes in these control decks, you would trim on Teferis. Don't do that if you're playing a Lotus Field build. The whole benefit of the way that this deck is constructed is the nut draws you get, where you get a Lotus Field into play, it untaps on turn 4, you play a Teferi, you get to, plus your Teferi, untap your Lotus Field, play an additional 4 mana card. So this, you're talking about turn 4, you're going to spend 9 mana some of the time. That is just an incredible advantage to get in a control deck. That is the easy way to win games with this deck. And that's part of your win equity, is just those really good draws that you're going to get where you're going to win quite easily. Looking at the rest of the lands, I'm mostly just playing the good dual lands. One thing I will say about this deck is, because sometimes you're going to have to sack lands to Lotus Field, you want to be a little bit careful. You want to try to maintain having something that counts as an island and plains into play, because it's going to allow you to put your Glacial Fortresses and your Castle Vantress and your Castle Ardenvale into play untapped, on subsequent turns. I've got one of each castle. I think neither one of them is particularly good, but I think that they're worth playing in small numbers. I've got 2 halls. I think Hall is the best between the castles and the halls. I think the Hall is the best land. Attacking with it does come up because, again, you're looking for a way to get Planeswalkers off the board in this build. Hall is one of the ways to do it. Also, the ability to activate an attack with a Hall is something that's going to come up a little bit more if you're ramping your mana with Lotus Field. 1 Eiganjo, 1 Otawara. They're not spectacular lands, but again, it's just a way to get some value out of your lands for almost free. And because you're playing with 28 lands, you really are looking for some way to convert some of your lands into spells as the game goes on. Some cycling lands, so another way to do that. Overall, the mana in this deck is pretty good. The only annoying thing is that sometimes your fortresses or your castles are going to come into play tapped, where you'd like them to come into play untapped. And you've got 4 Lotus Fields that are coming into play tapped, 4 Jwari Disruptions that come into play tapped, 3 Irrigated Farmlands that come into play tapped. So you are going to have some issues with your lands coming into play tapped. A little bit of that is just learning to sequence your lands properly, but some of that you just have to live with. Looking at the sideboard, there's a lot of options in the sideboard for Explorer, and the format isn't that well defined, so it's not exactly clear what decks you really need to target. I will say I've got 2 Unlicensed Hearses in my sideboard. I'm trying those over Rest in Peace or Soul Guide Lantern as my graveyard hate of choice. It's a little bit tricky because the graveyard decks that exist in Explorer, which are going to be Greasefang, looking to get, Parhelion out of the graveyard, and Arclight Phoenix, but it's not like a powered-up Arclight Phoenix with Faithless Looting. It's more of an Arclight Phoenix that plays more of a fair game. Those decks, you want some graveyard hate, but you can't go overboard because they can pretty easily play a fair game. So you're not going to get games where you just play Rest in Peace on turn 2 and that's it, their deck doesn't function anymore. You're going to get games where you play your graveyard hate on turn 1 or turn 2 and they're still going to play a game and they're still going to have a functional deck. So Unlicensed Hearth gives you a little bit more play in games like that. It also doesn't get in the way of your Memory Deluges. You have some ability to crew it from like the Wandering Emperor and your Shark tokens. Maybe there would be a situation where you'd want to crew it with the Hall of Storm Giants. That's kind of ridiculous. I mean, it could come up if you played a million games. You could also crew it with Strict Proctor. So there's some minor ability to crew it. I'm not sold that this is the best graveyard removal, but it's my leading candidate for right now. I've got 2 Baneslayer Angels, which I hated these in Historic when people would play them in Blue-White Control. I think that they're much more at home in Explorer. Unholy Heat doesn't exist, so your opponent's much less likely to just have a removal spell that kills it. Fry still exists, but it's not that popular of a sideboard card. I've gotten a lot of mileage out of these Baneslayers just boarding them in against like various red-black kind of mid-range strategies, because a lot of the time they have some removal for them, but they don't have a ton of removal for them. And Baneslayer is a card that a lot of the times, if you have one of them in play, whatever their strategy is just brick-walled. They are going to have cards like Noxious Grasp and Fry some, because they're planning to point them at your Teferis. But, you're going to have your Teferis in your deck anyway, so you're going to wind up eating that removal spell in a long game either way. And Baneslayer, it gives you another really strong high-impact card, which is nice. I've got 1 Leyline of Sanctity. There are a lot of decks in Explorer that they start with 4 Thoughtseizes and they board up to additional Duresses. And I wanted a little bit of Leyline to protect my hand. Also, there are some decks that are looking to just burn your face. Like when I was talking about don't play Absorb, it is true that you're occasionally going to get the matchup where Absorb is actually a good card. Leyline is also good against those decks. When Depopulate, like I talked about, just another sweeper. 1 Mystical Dispute, obviously for blue decks and for control mirrors. If you look at the sideboard, there's actually very little that you have to board in if you're playing against like a creatureless control deck or combo deck. We've got a Memory Deluge, a Dispute, a Dovin's Veto, and a Malevolent Hermit. But there aren't really that many cards you need to board out, and a lot of that is because you've got the Wandering Emperor in your deck in place of 4-mana, Wrath of God style cards that you're just never, that would never be useful in a lot of matchups. The Wandering Emperor is a good card in pretty much any matchup. You might want to occasionally trim them, but I don't think you're ever in a spot where you're like, I have to take this out of my deck. It's just too bad. It's a serviceable card in any matchup, and it's a strong card in a lot of matchups, which means that there's less pressure on your sideboard to have a ton of stuff to board in when your creature removal isn't working. Another Farewell, this again is if you play against food decks or just any deck that's looking to flood the board with a lot of artifacts and enchantments. Also, if you need more graveyard hate. Then we get to Aethergust and Devout Decree. There are a ton of really good sideboard cards like this that are legal in Explorer that are kind of cheap, targeted color hosers. I think Aethergust is the strongest of them. And then I've got a Devout Decree because I wanted another card that was good against red-black. Another Portable Hole. This is probably the card I feel the least strongly about, that you have to have it in your sideboard. I think it could easily change it into another targeted, color hate card, maybe. I wanted this specifically because of Ledger Shredder. In case you play against a deck that's got like Ledger Shredder and Sprite Dragon in it, something like that. As the format shakes out more, you might want to change this to something that's more applicable to the specific decks you're trying to target. So that was a long deck tech, but I think that there's a ton of choices in how to build this deck in Explorer, and I've iterated on a lot of them. And this is what I've come to, but I think that there's still probably more iterating to go. I'm going to go ahead and play this deck through a few ladder matches so we can see it in action, maybe see where some of the decision points on how to build the deck are, you know, helping me, or they've come to hurt me. Maybe we'll learn where some tweaks might be appropriate. I usually forget this or don't say it until the end of the video, but please, if you haven't already, sub to the channel. I'm definitely trying to grow the channel, and it's growing, and I really just, you know, the more it grows, the more I'm going to be excited about continuing to make these videos, the more I'm going to, you know, try to make additional new videos. I've got some great idea for some, you know, content that's going to be a little bit more involved for me to make. So subbing to the channel really does help, and it really motivates me to keep making the content. With that, let's jump into some games. I'm going to keep this hand because I hate mulliganing. This is a pretty strong hand against somebody who wants to Thoughtseize me. Probably not a great hand against somebody who's going to start with Lair of the Hydra. This could be mono green. It could also just be a green-red deck. It looks like it's probably mono green. I think I sequenced my lands a little bit poorly this game. I probably should have gone Glacial Fortress into Hollow the Storm Giants. I played in such a way that it made it so that if I had drawn a Lotus Field, it actually wouldn't have been that good for me. So this is actually red-green. I'm very glad that they played Klothys instead of the Lovestruck Beast on their turn. Probably too far behind at this point. This is one of those the things that happens with these control decks where you keep a lot of hands where you know you're not gonna beat your opponent's good draws, but if you mulligan too much, you're just not gonna have enough resources to beat any of their draws almost. So it puts you in a tough spot at times.
You know what? I'm not done.
I might be able to turn this one around still. I could probably make it so the Lovestruck Beast is unable to attack this turn. Or at a minimum, I can block it. And then next turn, I'm probably going to go for a minus with the Teferi and replay a new Teferi. Also, this is one of those spots where I might March of Otherworldly Light to a pitching. Although now that I've cast the Dovin's Veto, that's looking a little bit less likely. Might have to chump with the Strict Proctor this turn. This turned out great. They just don't even have a functional attack anymore. Okay, Wandering Emperor. Do I even need to minus with the Teferi this turn? It's probably a good idea to get Klothys off the board.
Let's take it back.
Alright.
And I will protect my people. This is what you get for hurting my people.
Wow, they're using a card to kill a Teferi. Excellent. That's the kind of thing I needed. And the scavengers. That's fine.
Remember your training.
I'm known for my excellent high over.
Come on, Lotus Field. You're not a Lotus Field. If I could draw a Lotus Field, I would actually be in pretty good shape because it would make it pretty easy for me to start using my mana a lot more efficiently, like making a giant shark or flashing back this Memory Deluge. All that would be on the table. I'm just going to eat the 1/1s. Keep the Wandering Emperor alive, so I'll have the option of exiling the Scavenging Ooze. And this doesn't even kill the Teferi. They do still have access to the Lovestruck Beast attacking because of the Lair of the Hydra. This is one of those spots where I actually like Discontinuity a lot. Like, I'm struggling a little bit to stabilize the board, and I'm effectively going to get Time Walk out of this Discontinuity. I think I should have cycled this before I made my land drop, in case I found Lotus Field. They did get to untap the Scavenging Ooze, so I don't have the option of just killing it with the Wandering Emperor. Just a little sad. I could go for minus again with the Teferi. I don't think I need to do that.
No time for a break.
I certainly don't need to do it now. Should I cast this? I think so. Guess we'll attack first. And then I'll be able to minus the Wandering Emperor to potentially have a chump blocker for the Lair of the Hydra if they wanted to send it at a Planeswalker. Also, I'm going to untap my Castle Ardenvale, so that'll give me another way to make a Planeswalker if I need, or to make a chump blocker for a Planeswalker if I need to. Clothis is back. Man, they really are not going to let me flash black a Memory Deluge. I was considering trying to set it up in a way that I would get to flash it back, but I think that's just not even worth trying to do. And that was Scavenging Ooze too. I guess they didn't exile it, which they really should have. Now they'll exile it, that's fine. I could respond. Do I want to? Yeah, I think I do. I'll punish them for their mistake.
need to move quickly.
And then this will give me a way to get Klothys off the board. And we may need to chump block this turn. But that's fine. I have such a resource advantage now that chump blocking is not a big deal. Alright, against this deck, obviously Ether Gust is great. I think Baneslayer Angel is also great. I think Portable Hole is pretty good. They had Werewolf Pack Leader. I'm sure they have Llanowar Elves in their deck. I'm not sure if we saw it. I think we saw it that game. They also had all those Scavenging Oozes, which probably they'll stay in. And we got Depopulate. So those are all appealing. What's not appealing? Farewell, I think, is a little bit on the expensive side. I've already got... I'm not sure I'm going to leave this one in my deck. Tail's End, I think, had no targets or very, very few targets. The way I sideboard with this deck, I almost never take Strict Proctor out of my deck. I basically never do. I do sometimes trim in the Tail's End Discontinuity part of the deck. I think I'm going to trim Tail's End here. I think it just didn't have enough targets. I guess they had Klothys. It wouldn't shock me if they had Embercleave in their deck, or if they boarded in some Chandras. I think it's just going to be worse than Discontinuity, though. Like, we saw that game, Discontinuity was... It maybe wasn't the key card in turning it around, but once I started to get a little bit of a control of the game, it was a very powerful card. Dovin's Veto, I think, was quite bad, even though we did hit the Lovestruck Beast. And then this is one of the matchups where I just don't... I think Saw It Coming is a general answer. It just isn't particularly exciting. I think I'm going to take the Farewell out of my deck as well. Doesn't make a ton of sense to have a 6-mana sweeper in my deck at the same time as Baneslayer Angel. And I think I'm going to trim Narset. This is one of those matchups where Narset, it's really hard, like it's almost impossible to keep it in play. So, I think that's what I'm going to do. Is it possible I want Devout Decree? I think their deck is mostly green creatures. I don't really want to put this in my deck just to hit Bonecrusher Giant. Alright, we got a turn 2 Jwari Disruption. This might be one of those hands where Tail's End would have been better. We'll see. No Werewolf Pack Leader, please. Come on, no Werewolf Pack Leader. Ranger class. That's perhaps less scary than Werewolf Pack Leader on turn 2, but it's going to be a problem as the game goes on, for sure. I think they're going to put the counter on the Wolf, and I'm just going to Fateful Absence it. Whoa, they have Snakeskin Veil in their deck too. Good. Come on, no land, Lovestruck Beast. I guess the Lovestruck Beast is kind of getting shut down by the Ranger class at this point anyway. I'll still, if I could Jwari Disruption, I still would have. I think my plan is to just take the hit from this. Leave myself access to Jwari Disruption, potentially. Alright, new plan. Now my plan is to make a Shark and chump this Lovestruck Beast with it. They have Bone Crusher Giant? They do. Can I survive this turn? Yeah, I can. It's not going to be pretty, though. Baneslayer Angel would not save me at this point. I need a sweeper. I guess I get to discontinuity. I'm gonna get to cycle my discontinuity. Oh, and they didn't add to the board, so that's nice. That definitely does not save me. Alright, another game, but this one I get to be on the play. Back, on the turn 2 Jwari Disruption again, but on the play it's so much more powerful. Ooh, Pelt Collector. I haven't seen that one out of the deck yet. Makes perfect sense to be playing with, though. Do I even care about that card? It's such a weak card. You can have it. Number 2, even. Wow. They played around Jwari Disruption pretty effectively. I guess I could have disrupted on turn 2, but it did not seem worth it. I don't regret my decision not doing that. I regret not cycling Shark Typhoon that turn. Come on, untapped land. Deck has not been kind to me. More enchantments. They boarded from a creature aggro deck to an enchantment aggro deck. Man. New double white mana. Come on, Lotus Field.
Let's skip to the good part.
The creatures can't be countered and they have Riot. Okay.
To move quickly.
A little bit late there, Lotus Field. Still maybe fast enough. And I get to gain life while they're kept out. Now they do have this Rhythm of the Wilds in play, so Hasty Trampler is going to ruin my day. But if they don't have a good turn this turn, they're probably going to die to their own Riling Vortexes. Another Scavenging Ooze, that's not the beginning of a good turn. I actually kill them next turn with all the Storm Giants if I just attack. Pelt Collector, alright. Llanowar Elves. More guys. All creatures, huh? So they left themselves dead on board. Or did they? One mana short of being able to kill them, right? Portable Hole plus minus, not quite enough.
Keep up the pace.
Still much to learn. May your blades strike true.
Friends don't let their friends board in Roiling Vortex in matchups like this. The game plays out this way fairly frequently, I would say.
Run away.
No, they're dead.
We must protect the people. Show them how we greet our enemies.
Oh, that was an awkward draw. Come on. Strict Proctor off the top of my deck. Don't want to leave up Jwari Disruption. I don't think I want to pay 2 life for the privilege of doing that. I should have actually played a Jwari Ruins as a land that turn. That would have been a much better play. For a card that doesn't even see much play in Standard, this thing gets played all the time in Explorer. I'm not sure it makes a ton of sense, but it is very popular. This is going to hit me down to 12 and then probably down to 8. And then I'm going to try to cast Farewell and we'll see if we can pick up the pieces from there. This has been too many lands to draw. If I draw a land every turn of the game, maybe one turn I draw Jwari Ruins. Ooh, no. It doesn't get hit by Farewell. That wasn't part of the plan. If I cast Farewell, I'm just dead on board to Hive of the Eye Tyrant plus the ping from Chandra. It was not enough spells. I needed more spells. Alright, I got a fair amount of sideboard stuff for this matchup. I like the Leyline. I like the Baneslayer Angels. I think Ether Gust is fine. They generally are going to have 4 Fable and the Mirror Breakers, probably some Croxas. They have the Blood Tithe Harvester. I think I like Farewell as well over Doomskar. Don't really like Portable Hull all that much in this matchup, and I think I'll take out Tail's End. Yeah, maybe Tail's End's better than Discontinuity here. And I'm going to board in another Memory Deluge over Shark Typhoon. Just to have more card drawing, more 2-for-1s. The way you beat these red-black decks is just, you need to keep up with them in 2-for-1s. I haven't had any hands so far this video where I actually got to cheat a Lotus Field into play. Maybe I'll top deck it Strict Proctor. Not next turn, but the turn after that would be the ideal time. That is not a Strict Proctor. I'm going to either cast Fateful Absence or cycle my Shark Typhoon this turn. Come on, Strict Proctor. Baneslayer Angel. If we were making a list of cards that are Strict Proctor, Baneslayer Angel would obviously not be on it because it is not. I guess I'll Deluge now so that that thing doesn't flip. Well, there's the Strict Proctor. I want another land that comes into play tapped. I guess. Soaring the Mirthless. There will be no mirth. I promise you. Angrath, the Unchained. Yikes. wonder if they're going to take my Strict Proctor. Opponent discards a card and loses 2 life. Sold.
Trust me. Let's skip to the good part.
So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to, in my end step, untap the 2 Lotus Fields. Wandering Emperor of the Graveyard Trespasser, pitching Strict Proctor.
My travels. Let me show you.
And I'm going to Fateful Absence the Angrath.
I am almost sad to see you go.
Best start thinking fast.
It's looking like the right decision between Tail's End and Discontinuity was Tail's End, because Tail's End can counter these Planeswalkers. And we've seen 3 different Planeswalkers from them. I'm sure they don't have 4 of each of them, but they've got some amount of some of them. We know that much. Okay.
Hurry.
They probably don't have Fry in their hand right now, so I'm actually going to put the counter on the Strict Proctor, I guess.
Remember your training.
So I can get it to be a big enough size so I can just block the Rekindling Phoenix next turn. Of course, I can also, next turn, just minus on Rekindling Phoenix and mount an Assault. I think that's going to be my preferred play.
Time is much more malleable than people.
This forces a chump block, and then I can make 2/2. And I think my opponent's officially in trouble.
May your blade strike true.
So there we can see they have Go Blank and Thoughtseize in their deck. So there are things that Leyline can affect. I didn't see any reason to really want to change how I boarded. Certainly, if they're going to have a lot of Planeswalkers and they're going to have Rekindling Phoenix, I do not want to populate Doomskar type cards. Unless it first does a little bit against the Phoenix, although I'm not going to be playing with very many ways that the Phoenix is going to go to the graveyard, so I don't think that that's something that's appealing. We still haven't seen Kroxa, but it wouldn't surprise me if they have 2 or 3 in their deck. Still, I'm not going to put the Hearse in my deck for this matchup. We got a little bit of the Lotus Field synergies last game. We haven't had any of the really busted hands yet. This one, there's still hope. If I draw Lotus Field for turn 3. There's a little bit of tension with Strict Proctor, whether you want to play it on turn 2 or wait till, the turn you're going to play the Lotus Field. That I mean, it didn't work out great, but I have the Discontinuity as backup. And also, they used their third turn on killing my Strict Proctor, which I certainly didn't care about having Strict Proctor in play. So that's not bad. Now this is... We're going to get to see this deck completely run away with the game now.
If you show remorse,
Opponent stumbled a little bit, and I'm getting to have this, the Lotus Field Teferi thing. This is, I think this is still turn 4. I think this is just the great turn 4 draw.
I am the Emperor of Kamigawa, and I will protect my... Let your blade do the talking.
I don't think their deck is capable of beating a Shark Typhoon from the spot.
For intruders.
Next turn I'll have the option of flashing back. I guess if they go blank me, that's their best possible. I don't think it's going to be good enough, but it would have done something.
Show them how we greet our enemies.
They knew that the Memory Deluge, making a 4/4 Shark, was more than they could handle. I'm going to leave it there. Hope you guys liked that introduction into blue-white control in Explorer. I don't know that it quite has what it takes to be like a tier 1 deck, but I think it's certainly a competitive deck. So if you like playing control decks, I think that this is a pretty good format to try to do it in. I think this is a pretty good build of control. And it's also nice just that Explorer is not a super well-defined format, which makes it a little bit harder to target with a control deck, but you do get to... It feels like there's a lot more of your deck building decisions that really matter, because you're in a broader format when you're building a control deck. You need to look for any efficiencies you can get to save on sideboard space, or to, make sure you're picking the removal spells that cover as broad a part of the format as possible while still being good. And, certainly the Wandering Emperor is helping there. And just like the choices, whether you play 2 Ether Gusts and Devout Decree, or you swap those, or you go and you pick different cards, that stuff really matters in a broad format like Explorer is right now. So I think it's a great deck to, experiment with on the ladder and try to tweak the build to get it to exactly where you like it. So I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I will see you next time.